So today we're talking about buying process. Buying process can be deemed as being long, very, very complicated. So let's just see if we can break it down and make it a little bit easier for you. So what we're going to look at is there are two main parts to the process. There's the mortgage process and then there's the legal process. So the mortgage process is going to start with two things. Basically, you can run these two processes side by side alongside each other anyway. So we're going to look at the broker stages, and after that we'll look at the conveyancing steps. So with your broker stages, there's going to be two parts to that. One part is going to be the valuation, and the second part is going to be, the first part of the valuation, when they're going to go look at the property, and the second part is going to look at you and they're going to do underwriting. So those two bits will need to be done so we can then produce a mortgage offer, and a mortgage offer basically means then that the property, the money's ready and waiting for you to go. So when your solicitor asks for it, the lender will then send your money to the solicitor, put the rest of your money, and then you can then complete on your property. But let's go back a few steps. So the two stages are going to be, first of all, with the application. Once we know what property you're buying, we'll be doing the underwriting and the valuation. The underwriting is where they look at you, and they're going to be basically asking you for things like, for example, making sure that you are who you say you are. So they're probably going to look at your ID. They want to make sure you're not being fraudulent on your income. So they're probably going to want to see pay slips, for example, and bank statements to see that pay coming in. They want to make sure it's affordable, so then look through your statements to make sure that you don't have too many outgoings or other loans that we may have missed or anything like that. And we'll have a look at then your income coming in, your outgoings going out, make sure enough left over basically better pay your mortgage. And once they've finished underwriting, sometimes it's done at the same time, they'll do the property valuation. That's where they'll instruct an independent surveyor who will then go out to the property and have a look at the property itself, make sure there's no kind of issues with it, make sure it's suitable security for the bank. So for example, some surveyors may not like properties which are maybe made from an unusual construction type. That could be where they're made from wood, maybe they're made from maybe they're kind of metal framed, potentially they're in unusual settings, maybe they're above commercial premises or above shops, bars or restaurants. Sometimes those can be a bit of a pickle to kind of get through. Sometimes they're in areas which maybe the lender may or may not like, so we'd want to make sure really that the lender would deem your property as being suitable security, and they do that by way of, as I say, an independent surveyor going out and looking at the property on behalf of the bank. Now with that, you can also have other types of survey as well. So for example, you can ask for a home buyers report or a full survey. The difference between those three are the following basically. The lender survey or the entry level survey is literally just for the bank. It's just for them to make sure there's nothing weird and quirky, nothing weird and wonderful. It doesn't have Japanese knotweed in the garden. It's not structurally unsafe. It is definitely livable. It does have a kitchen and a bathroom, and they just want to make sure all those bits and pieces, make sure that it's all okay. But that actual valuation is just for the lender. So sometimes you won't even get a copy of that valuation. It's purely for the lender to make sure they're happy to lend on it. First type of valuation is going to be an entry-level valuation, so it's just for the lender. The second type is going to be home buyers, and we strongly recommend you look at either home buyers or a full property survey on any property that you purchase. Really, it's like getting an MOT for your property. You wouldn't buy your car without an MOT, same way you probably wouldn't buy a property without having a survey done there. The reason surveys are really important because that's going to tell you almost what work's going to be done to the property over the next, say, 5-10 years or so. Plus also they spend a bit longer in the property as well, so sometimes they can spot more defects of the property. And obviously you want to make sure you're buying a property that you can afford, and you also know you can afford to maintain as well. So a home buyers report operates a traffic light type system, with green meaning everything's good, amber means that the property might need a bit of work, and red means that it really seriously needs looking at. So you'll get a report which is around about 15-20 pages long. And once you've got that report, I'll strongly recommend giving it to your broker to have a little bit of a look through. Some of these things will always be read. So for example, on a home buyers report, they can't necessarily tell you about the plumbing because they're not plumbers. They can't necessarily tell you about electrics, they're not electricians. They can't tell you about the boiler because they don't service boilers. So all of those areas will always be read. So whenever you get a home buyers report, first thing you can do is don't panic, because they always look terrible. They always look absolutely awful. But have a look through them, look at what parts they can't look at, what parts they're not sure about, and have a look through the report. First thing to do is not to panic. But have a look through the report. Say some of these things will always be read, so kind of put those to one side, and we have those checked afterwards. But really concentrate on any things that are read that really are important, such as the structure of the property, any roof repairs that needs to be done. You may need to replace panes of glass, for example, that are frosted or letting water in. So having a look through that with either someone who knows a bit about property, whether it be, the estate agent, your broker, a builder, will definitely be able to kind of handhold you through those bits and pieces. The third type of survey is a full structural survey, and that's really, you'd probably have a full structural survey if, say, for example, I know you'd notice an earlier defect for the property, either with the lender's own survey or the home buyer survey, or you can just have a full survey because you want to have a full survey. These typically can be quite a bit more expensive. Typically they're £800 to £1,000, whereas a home buyer's may only be £500, for example. The lender's survey will tend to be, sometimes they're free, sometimes they're a couple of £100. They're not a huge amount, but they're not kind of giving the lender, a huge amount of information. They're just making sure the lender's nice and safe. So a full structural survey is where they'd have someone who's, structurally aware of the property, have a look around the whole house and tell you what work needs to be done, any kind of remedial work needs to be done. You'd probably point them to something which you may have seen on an earlier report would need to be fixed. So from that point of view, you would probably say to them, look, we've had the lender's survey come back in again, and it said potentially the property maybe has a defect, such as, I don't know, it needs a new roof, or maybe it's structurally unsound, or they're not sure about, I don't know, the damp in this room, so you maybe a damp and timber survey, or we're not sure about the trees that are kind of, next door because they're causing the property to be slightly uneven. So all of the valuations may ask for a kind of a specialist report. As I say, even a full survey potentially, if there's something not sure of, they may ask for additional reports to be done. Any additional reports to be done will probably come as a cost, but you probably want to kind of, the vendor who's selling the property is going to really want to make sure that anyone who tries to buy the property is going to come across the same issue. So sometimes you can have a negotiation with the vendor and say, look, we're not maybe ready to buy the property until these additional reports have been done. Or sometimes, a home buyer survey is a really, really good way, or a full structure is a really, really good way of maybe make sure there are no defects on the property. But the other thing to be aware of as well is that sometimes when our clients get home buyers reports, they do sometimes find there is a little bit of work to be done, but just bear in mind it doesn't necessarily mean the property is worth any less money, because the bank may have already gone out and valued the property at the current value in its current state. So just bear in mind that just because there are a few bits and pieces to be done on the property, it doesn't necessarily mean that you should ask for a chunk of money less, because the property is that money, potentially because there is work that needs to be done. So that kind of wraps up, hopefully, surveys in a really, really long-winded way. So once the lender has been out and they've looked at the property valuation, done the underwriting, so they've looked at you and they've looked at the property, the next thing we'll do now is to create a mortgage offer. And that mortgage offer, binding offer from the lender that says, yes, we're ready to lend you this amount of money on this property at this rate over this term. And that money, that offer is ready and sitting there and waiting then until your solicitor says, right, yep, we're ready to go with the legals, please can we have that money now. So once you've got your mortgage offer, it then goes over then back to conveyancing. So what will normally happen is you found your property, next step's going to be to instruct your solicitor and tell your broker you now want to go ahead. So the legal process is going to start with some paperwork coming out to you, and that's just to make sure for you to fill in for the solicitor to make sure they know what property you're buying and that sort of stuff. You will send those paperwork then back to the solicitor. Once they receive those in, they'll get contracts in from the other selling solicitor, from the one that you're buying from. And from that point onwards, the solicitor will ask then for searches to be carried out. A search basically is whereby they go to local council and say, please can you tell me all about the property. They can sometimes take between a week and a month to kind of come back into solicitor, and that's really when the solicitor knows a little bit more about the history of your property and has all the paperwork for it. At that point on then, she can ask lots of questions to the selling solicitor, and once she's answered those questions, those are called inquiries. And both solicitors will go forwards and backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards, backwards, and sometimes forwards and backwards and forwards, backwards and forwards and backwards, more and more and more and more and more, until all those questions have been answered. So sometimes there are over 200 inquiries that solicitors have to kind of go through and agree on between your buying solicitor and the person who's selling the property, their solicitor as well. Once all those inquiries have been answered, you're then in a position then to report to your own solicitor, will be in a position then to report to you, tell you, yes, we're all good, all our questions have been answered, and everything back from the counter, we're all good to go. So let's start moving forward. And they can talk about then exchanging and completing. An exchange is basically whereby everything has been done from both sides. So you'd literally exchange contracts from one point to another. And that's really when you'd put down your deposit, and at that point then, all the way down the process, between 3 and 5 months time, that's when you know the property is finally yours, because you've exchanged contracts and paid a deposit towards it. Up until then, the system's a little bit of a nightmare, to be honest with you, and it can sometimes go wrong. So that's the reason why it's only really up until exchange that you're both properly tied in. After that will come completion, And completion is then when they take the money from your mortgage provider and add it in. And they'll add in the rest of your money, and then you basically complete on that property, and that's the date when you get your key. So now we're coming towards the end of conveyancing. We've got the mortgage already sitting there. All the solicitor needs to do now is basically exchange the property, which whereby they would literally take your contract you've signed, their contract they've signed, and kind of slide them around to each other. Then your property's exchanged. So over and above that, then I'm going to talk about completion, which is when you actually move into your home. They request the money down from the lender, add in money you've got, and pay the person that you've already sent your deposit to. When they've received that money, that's when they'll give you your keys. And that is when you can finally complete on your property. Fanfare. One of the other really important things to look at when you're going through the buying process is probably just to make sure you've looked at, for example, things like your home insurance. In order to complete on your property, you have to have home insurance. If it's a freehold property or if it's a leasehold property, you're going to want to make sure that there is insurance policy in place, because that will be a prerequisite of the lender. The other kind of fairly smart thing to be looking at that point, because you're taking a relatively big debt, is maybe to look at some sort of protection for you, whether that be life insurance, critical illness. It could be income protection benefits to cover you in case you're suddenly ill. It's those sorts of things we want to put in place by the time you complete also. So after you've done all those bits and pieces, you've now completed, it's now time to arrange your moving in party. So make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another episode. Thanks for watching.